The world watched as Prince Harry walked away from everything he once knew. The gilded walls of Buckingham Palace, the centuries-old traditions of monarchy, and even the protective shield of his brother and father. He did it for love, or so he believed. But love has a way of cutting the deepest wounds, especially when loyalty is not returned. For years, Harry's story was painted as one of rebellion and devotion. The prince who gave up his crown for a woman he thought was worth the risk. Yet behind the carefully crafted smiles and the polished public statements, a darker reality was taking shape. And it all came crashing down with the discovery of a single hidden letter. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. This wasn't just any letter. It was Meghan Markle's private words to another man, a lover, if whispers are to be believed. In it, she didn't merely confess affection for someone else. She mocked Harry. She called him weak. She described him as easy to control, naive, gullible, a man she could bend to her will without resistance. The words tore through him like glass shattering against stone. Because this was not the voice of a supportive partner, but the voice of someone who saw him as a pawn, a puppet, a man stripped of dignity in the very marriage he thought had given him freedom. Imagine the scene. Harry alone, staring at the letter in disbelief, his hands trembling as the sentences carved into his soul. He had turned his back on his family, his royal role, and even his country for Meghan, and now here were her words, proof that he was nothing more than a tool in her story. For a man haunted by the loss of his mother and desperate for unconditional love, the betrayal was crushing. It wasn't just about infidelity. It was humiliation, exposure, and the collapse of trust all at once. This is where our story begins. A hidden letter, a broken prince, and a revelation that could shake the royal narrative to its core. Before the hidden letter ever surfaced, before the headlines screamed betrayal, and before Prince Harry's private life was pulled apart piece by piece, there was the illusion of calm. To understand the weight of what the letter did to Harry, one must first remember the image the world believed about him and Meghan Markle. It was the fairy tale that gripped millions, a prince who had walked away from an institution for the sake of love, standing side by side with a woman who promised freedom, modernity, and compassion. Harry, always the more rebellious of the two royal brothers, seemed to have finally found the life he had longed for. Or at least, that was the picture that had been carefully painted. In California, the Montecito mansion became a symbol of their new beginning. Harry was often seen smiling beside Meghan, presenting himself as the doting husband who had found purpose beyond royal duty. Together, they gave speeches about mental health, about hope, and about courage. They launched podcasts, signed lucrative deals, and made appearances designed to remind the world that their love story was stronger than the crown they had left behind. Yet, behind the golden glow of interviews and staged photographs, tension brewed. Those closest to Harry whispered about the changes they saw in him. He was no longer the light-hearted soldier with a mischievous grin. He was quiet, more withdrawn, often repeating Meghan's words instead of his own. This transformation did not happen overnight. The Harry who once joked openly with journalists and threw his arm around soldiers in Afghanistan began to shrink into the background, letting Meghan lead. Some saw this as growth, a man maturing and learning to support his wife. Others saw it as the slow erosion of his individuality, a prince being molded into a figure of convenience. The truth sat somewhere in between, and that truth became clearer when compared to how Harry interacted with his family. His relationship with Prince William, once a bond of brotherhood forged in shared tragedy, grew strained. Reports of bitter arguments surfaced, disagreements over Meghan's place in the family, and Harry's refusal to hear advice from anyone but her. What was once brotherly counsel now sounded like an attack in his ears, because Meghan's voice had already framed them as adversaries. King Charles, too, was kept at a distance. A father who had once extended the possibility of reconciliation found himself cut out of his youngest son's life, as Meghan and Harry built new walls around themselves. To the public, the couple insisted they were free and thriving. But the signs of fracture were already visible. The canceled projects, the awkward interviews, the nervous body language Harry displayed whenever Meghan dominated conversations. Even his most loyal supporters began to wonder, was Harry truly happy, or was he simply playing a role? The The calm before the storm was deceptive, like the quiet surface of a lake that hides deep, unseen currents. Harry clung to the narrative of love and loyalty, convincing himself that the sacrifices he had made were worth it. He told himself that being away from the royal family was liberating, even as loneliness gnawed at him in private. The palace he had once called home now seemed like a cage in his memory, and Meghan's world of California sun and Hollywood friends was the paradise he was supposed to believe in. But within him, doubts lingered. He had placed absolute trust in one person, convinced himself that she was his partner in everything, and silenced the warnings of those who loved him most. The calm was not peace. It was the fragile stillness that comes before the collapse, the delicate pause in which betrayal is still hidden but already breathing beneath the surface. Harry could not see it yet, but the foundations of his new life were built on sand. The letter, still tucked away at this point, was a time bomb waiting to explode. And when it did, the carefully constructed illusion of calm would be obliterated, leaving only the raw, painful truth behind. This was Harry's life before the storm. A man convinced he had finally found love and freedom, yet unknowingly standing on the edge of heartbreak that would test not only his marriage but his very identity. It happened quietly, almost too quietly for the gravity of what was uncovered. There was no grand revelation in front of cameras, no dramatic public confrontation. Instead, the discovery of the letter that would unravel Prince Harry's fragile sense of stability began in the most unassuming way, tucked away in a place that was never meant to be disturbed. For Harry, the moment he laid eyes on it was the beginning of a descent he could never have prepared himself for. The question of how the letter surfaced remains shrouded in speculation. Some say it was found by a member of staff in Montecito, someone who had grown increasingly uneasy about the atmosphere in the household. Others whisper that Harry himself stumbled across it while looking for something entirely different. Whatever the truth, the outcome was the same. A folded piece of paper, its words etched with the kind of raw disdain that could slice deeper than any blade. Harry's life, until that point, had been carefully managed in a bubble. Despite rumors and the occasional tabloid headline, he had convinced himself of Meghan's loyalty. He believed in her words of love and her promises of partnership. So when he first unfolded that letter, his mind did not immediately register the betrayal. He read the sentences slowly, almost cautiously, his brain trying to reinterpret the words into something less cruel. But denial has limits, and the words written in Meghan's hand carried a sting that could not be softened. In the letter, Meghan was not writing to Harry. She was addressing someone else entirely, a person she described with affection and admiration. But what struck Harry most was not the intimacy directed at another, but the way she spoke of him. She mocked him. She described him as weak, naive, and easy to control. She bragged about how she had convinced him to turn against his family, how she could guide his choices without resistance. Each phrase landed like a hammer blow, stripping away the armor of devotion he had wrapped himself in. Imagine the silence of that room as Harry read. His hands shook, his chest tightened, and his vision blurred. He had faced battles in Afghanistan, endured the loss of his mother, and survived the relentless intrusion of the press. But this wound was different. It came not from an enemy or a stranger, but from the very person he had sacrificed everything for. In that moment, Harry's world collapsed inward. He was no longer the husband who had defied a monarchy for love. He was the man mocked as a puppet in the private words of his wife. The discovery of the letter did not just expose betrayal. It forced Harry to confront a question that had been haunting him for years, but that he had pushed aside. Had he been manipulated from the very beginning? Those who knew him best, his brother William, his father Charles, and even longtime friends from his army days, had tried to warn him. They had raised concerns about Meghan's intentions, about the way she pulled him away from the people who had always stood by him. Harry, blinded by love and desperate for validation, ignored them all. Now, with the letter in his hands, he realized those voices had not been jealous or cruel. They had been right. But what was he to do? The discovery of such a letter placed him in an impossible position. Confront Meghan and risk her wrath? Pretend he never saw it and live with the gnawing knowledge of betrayal? Or take the first step toward reclaiming himself, even if it meant tearing apart the life he had built in California? His heart battled his mind, torn between the man who wanted to believe in love and the man who knew he had been played. For hours, perhaps even days, Harry sat with the letter. He read it over and over again, as if repetition might dull the pain or change the meaning. But the words never softened. They only grew sharper, echoing louder each time his eyes fell on them. Weak, gullible, easy to control. These were not the descriptions of a man loved. These were the words of someone who saw him as a means to an end. The discovery of the letter marked the true beginning of Harry's unraveling. It stripped away the illusions he had clung to, forcing him to face the brutal reality that the woman he had defended at all costs may never have seen him as an equal partner. He was not her prince in shining armor. He was her pawn, her project, her shield against a world she wanted to conquer. And as that realization sank in, Harry began to understand that his life would never be the same again. The storm had arrived, not with thunder and lightning, but with the quiet crack of paper being unfolded, a few cruel sentences written in ink, and the breaking of a man's heart. The letter itself became more than just paper and ink. It was a weapon, sharp enough to pierce through layers of trust, loyalty, and love that Harry thought were unshakable. Its contents were not a fleeting remark or a careless phrase scribbled in haste. No, it was deliberate, structured, and chilling in its honesty. Meghan's words dripped with a confidence that seemed to revel in Harry's blind devotion. And as each sentence unfolded, the tone became unmistakably cruel, transforming from a personal correspondence into a mirror that reflected a reality Harry had never wanted to believe. It began innocently enough, at least on the surface. She addressed the recipient with warmth, affection, and a familiarity that could not be mistaken for anything other than intimacy. The way she chose her words showed a relationship that carried more than casual friendliness. It was laced with familiarity, the kind reserved for someone she trusted deeply. But quickly, the tone shifted. As Meghan shifted the subject to her marriage, the mockery bled through. Harry was described not as a partner, not as a man who stood beside her, but as someone she had conquered, someone she could manage and manipulate at will. She called him naive. She wrote that convincing him to distance himself from his family had been easier than she ever imagined. She admitted with an almost mocking pride that she had whispered doubts into his ears until he turned against the very institution that defined his identity. To the recipient, she bragged that Harry believed every word she fed him, that he followed her lead unquestioningly, mistaking manipulation for love. These were not the words of a supportive spouse. They were the words of someone who saw power in control, someone who enjoyed bending another human being into submission. There were passages where Meghan laughed at Harry's loyalty. She described him as gullible, saying he was too blinded by his desire to protect her to notice when she pushed him into conflicts that benefited her image. She confessed that whenever Harry spoke out against his brother or his father, it was usually after she had carefully planted the seed of resentment. The letter painted Harry not as the independent man the public once admired, but as a figure moved around on a chessboard, his strings pulled by someone who understood his vulnerabilities all too well. One of the most brutal lines, the one that struck Harry hardest, was her claim that he was weak. Not just weak in the traditional sense, but weak because he was desperate for love, desperate for validation, and willing to trade away everything just to hold on to her approval. She wrote it as if it were a joke, a quip meant to amuse her secret confidant. But to Harry, it was the cruelest cut of all. His entire life had been shaped by the loss of his mother, his search for belonging, his need to protect the people he loved. And here was the woman he had trusted most, turning his deepest scars into the very reason she could control him. The letter went further, even touching on the public image they had crafted together. Meghan hinted that their interviews, their speeches, and even their grand declarations of independence were part of a larger plan, a plan she orchestrated while Harry played his part. She claimed he was so desperate to be seen as strong and independent that he never realized she was the one scripting the narrative behind the scenes. She described how easy it was to push him onto stages, to have him deliver words that fit her ambitions, and how he never questioned her intentions because he trusted her blindly. What made the letter even more devastating was its tone. It wasn't written in sorrow or even frustration. It was playful, mocking, almost gleeful. Meghan's words danced on the page with a confidence that came from believing Harry would never see them. There was no attempt to soften her judgments, no hesitation in describing him as less than a man, as less than her equal. She wrote freely, certain her words would remain hidden, and that freedom revealed her unfiltered truth. For Harry, reading the letter was like hearing his worst fears spoken aloud. He had always suspected that the sacrifices he made, leaving his family, abandoning his royal duties, enduring the ridicule of the press, had cost him more than they had given. But he had silenced those doubts, reassuring himself that it was all for love. Now, in black and white, he saw the evidence that it was never about love in the way he believed. To her, it was about control, about image, about power. He was not her partner. He was her proof that she could reshape even the most untouchable institution to her will. Harry lingered on one particular section that read like a confession of strategy. Meghan admitted that she had studied him, learned his weaknesses, and used them to her advantage. She referenced his grief over Diana, noting how easy it was to present herself as a protector against the same forces that had destroyed his mother. She acknowledged that his anger at the press, his frustration with palace bureaucracy, and his yearning for a life of freedom were all vulnerabilities she could harness. And she had. She wrote it as though it were an achievement, as though she deserved applause for turning a grieving prince into a man who would follow her into exile without hesitation. The sting of betrayal was not only in the content, but in the realization that everything Harry thought was real had been orchestrated. He reread the words again and again, hoping he had misunderstood, hoping that the letter's tone was exaggerated or sarcastic. But there was no mistaking it. Meghan's words were deliberate, her descriptions precise, her confidence unwavering. She had written her truth, and that truth shattered his world. In those pages, Harry saw himself not as the strong, independent man he wanted to be, but as the caricature his wife described. Weak, gullible, easy to control. Every decision he had made for her, every battle he had fought, every bridge he had burned now looked like the moves of a man manipulated into submission. The letter was more than evidence of betrayal. It was the confession of someone who never respected him, who never saw him as equal, and who never intended for him to discover the truth. That discovery marked the beginning of his unraveling. And as he folded the letter back into its envelope, his hands shaking, he knew that nothing, not his marriage, not his family, not his identity, would ever be the same again. The letter had been discovered, its cruel words seared into his mind, and now came the inevitable aftermath. Prince Harry, a man who had once been celebrated as the most resilient of the Windsor brothers, found himself breaking in ways he had never imagined. For years he had weathered storms. Tabloid assaults, paparazzi hounding him since childhood, the devastating loss of his mother at such a tender age, even the tense rows with his family that left him alienated. Yet none of those battles could prepare him for this one, because the wound was carved from the hand of the woman he had believed in above all else. This was not an external attack. This was betrayal from the very heart of his world. In the days immediately following the discovery, Harry became unrecognizable to those around him. Staff whispered about his silence, his absence at meals, his tendency to retreat into corners of the Montecito estate where no one could find him. He would sit for hours in the garden or the study, the letter folded and unfolded until the creases became frayed. Each time he read it, he felt the same jolt of disbelief. And yet he kept reading, as though torturing himself was the only way to understand how his life had reached this point. Sleep became a stranger. At night, he would pace the halls, haunted by Meghan's words. Weak, gullible, easy to control. They echoed in his head, drowning out every speech he had ever given about strength and resilience, every moment where he had convinced the world that he was in charge of his destiny. Those words clung to him like chains, dragging him deeper into despair. He remembered the countless interviews where he had defended Meghan against criticism, where he had looked into cameras and assured the world that their bond was unbreakable. Now, with her mocking voice preserved in ink, he felt like a fool who had been putting on a performance for an audience that saw more truth than he ever did. The collapse was not just emotional, it was physical. His shoulders hunched, his face lost its spark, and his eyes carried the exhaustion of a man aged far beyond his years. Friends who called him, sensing something was wrong, found themselves speaking to a shell of the Harry they once knew. His responses were short, his laughter forced, and conversations ended quickly. He avoided discussing Meghan, avoided any mention of family, avoided anything that might remind him of the world collapsing around him. It was not the first time Harry had broken down in private, but this was different. The death of Diana had shattered him as a boy, and he had carried that wound into adulthood. But even that grief, as soul-crushing as it was, had a clarity to it. His mother was gone, taken from him by forces outside his control. This betrayal, however, was different. It was a conscious choice by someone he trusted, and that made it unbearable. To lose his mother was tragedy. To lose his wife in this way was humiliation. One night, consumed by his thoughts, Harry reportedly confided in an old friend over the phone. His voice cracked as he admitted he didn't recognize himself anymore. He confessed that he felt like a puppet, and that maybe the world had been right all along when it said he was under Meghan's spell. This admission was devastating for him because Harry prided himself on being his own man, a soldier who had fought in Afghanistan, a prince who had taken his destiny into his own hands. To suddenly see himself, through Meghan's words, as weak, naive, controlled, destroyed the very foundation of who he thought he was. Tears became common, sometimes uncontrollable. He wept not only for the betrayal but for the years he had lost, the bridges he had burned, the family ties he had severed in Meghan's defense. He thought of William, the brother who had warned him. He thought of Charles, the father who had tried, however imperfectly, to keep him close. He thought of his grandmother, Queen Elizabeth, who had once offered him guidance he now realized he had thrown aside. In Meghan's letter, he didn't just see her contempt for him. He saw the reflection of his own mistakes, his blindness, and the painful realization that he had abandoned those who had truly loved him for someone who mocked him in secret. Even Meghan noticed the shift. Harry, who had once been eager to stand beside her at every event, now pulled back. He avoided her gaze at times, struggled to maintain their public image, and became increasingly distant in private. Meghan, ever skilled in controlling narratives, tried to soothe him, dismissing the letter as a misunderstanding or claiming that it had been taken out of context. But Harry could not unsee the words. He could not erase the sting of her laughter on the page, the pride she had taken in manipulating him. No explanation could silence the voice that whispered to him now, reminding him every day of her betrayal. The emotional collapse spread into his work. Projects tied to their brand began to falter as Harry lost his focus. He missed deadlines, grew disinterested in appearances, and often seemed disconnected during interviews. Observers speculated that he was battling depression, but few could guess the real cause. The hidden letter remained his private torment, his unspoken truth, the anchor pulling him under while the world watched him drown without knowing why. What made it worse was that Harry still loved her. Despite the humiliation, despite the pain, his heart clung stubbornly to the idea that Meghan was the woman he had fought for. Love, even betrayed love, does not dissolve overnight. This contradiction tore at him relentlessly. How could he love someone who so clearly disdained him? How could he walk away when he had built his entire life around her? These questions gnawed at him until he felt hollow inside, paralyzed between love and loathing, between devotion and despair. This was Harry's emotional collapse in its rawest form. A man who had once stood before the world as a symbol of courage and conviction, reduced to a broken figure replaying his mistakes in endless loops. The letter had not simply mocked him. It had stripped him of his sense of self, leaving behind a man who no longer knew where he belonged or who he truly was. After the shock of the letter's discovery and the devastation of its words began to sink in, another question clawed its way into Harry's mind. Who exactly was Meghan writing to? Betrayal is always painful, but when it is faceless, it becomes a torment that eats away at every waking moment. The letter had not mentioned a name outright. Instead, it was peppered with pet names, suggestive descriptions, and subtle hints that pointed towards someone familiar, someone trusted, someone close enough to inspire Meghan's confidence. For Harry, the mystery of the recipient became as agonizing as the words themselves. The first instinct was paranoia. Every man who had crossed paths with Meghan became a potential suspect in Harry's mind. He thought of figures in Hollywood, people Meghan had met during her acting career, directors and producers who had once been in her orbit. He thought of wealthy patrons and political contacts, the sort of men who moved in the same high society circles that Meghan was so eager to impress. He wondered if it could be someone from his own world, perhaps a friend who had betrayed him, someone who had stood by his side publicly but privately entertained Meghan's affections. The uncertainty was unbearable. Harry tried to retrace the details Meghan had woven into her writing. There were references to events that Harry himself had not attended, dinners and conversations she had claimed were innocent networking but now appeared in a new light. There were mentions of laughter over private jokes, phrases too intimate to be shared between mere acquaintances. The language was playful, flirty, and confident, suggesting that this was not a fleeting connection but an ongoing relationship of some kind, whether emotional or physical. Speculation swirled. Among staff, whispers grew louder, each theory more scandalous than the last. Some believed the recipient was a Hollywood executive tied to Meghan's streaming deals, someone she had leaned on for influence and visibility. Others pointed to political acquaintances, powerful men who had seen in Meghan an ambitious partner eager to climb higher. And then there were darker suspicions that the recipient might have been someone close to Harry himself, a betrayal not just of marriage but of friendship. Harry's mind raced through possibilities. He remembered moments that once seemed insignificant but now carried a sinister weight. Meghan's late-night phone calls she brushed off as business. The way she lingered after certain events, insisting she had more to discuss with contacts while Harry left early. Even the warmth in her smile when she greeted some men in public, the way her laughter rang a little louder, seemed in retrospect like a clue he had ignored. The letter turned those memories into daggers, each one stabbing at his trust. Yet the cruelest part was that the letter was vague enough to keep him guessing forever. Meghan was careful, almost calculating, in how much she revealed. She wrote with intimacy but without specifics, as though she anticipated the possibility of discovery and wanted to keep her secrets safe even if the letter fell into the wrong hands. For Harry, this ambiguity was torture. Every word carried weight, but every omission carried suspicion. Outside their private world, rumors began to leak. Tabloids, always hungry for royal scandal, seized on the story with vigor. Headlines speculated about lovers in Los Angeles, about Meghan's closeness to certain producers, about mysterious dinners where Harry was absent. Analysts dissected her past relationships, scrutinized old photographs, and pieced together timelines that suggested opportunities for betrayal. The identity of the lover became a global guessing game, one that left Harry humiliated on an even larger stage. Friends tried to console him, insisting that speculation was dangerous, that without a name the letter could have been written to no one in particular, or even crafted as some manipulative tactic. But Harry could not let it go. To him, the existence of the letter itself was proof enough. Whether the recipient was real or imagined, the words spoke to Meghan's contempt, her willingness to belittle him, and her desire to confide in someone else about his weaknesses. For Harry, it did not matter whether the lover was a physical presence or a symbolic one. The damage was the same. Still, he could not silence the gnawing thought. If it was real, if Meghan had truly been confiding in another man, then that man knew Harry's deepest humiliation before he did. The idea that someone else had laughed with her at his expense was unbearable. In the eyes of the world, Harry was already vulnerable, already seen as the prince who gave up everything for love. To think that he had become a joke in private correspondence with another man cut deeper than any headline could. Meghan, of course, denied everything when confronted. She dismissed the letter as harmless, claimed it was taken out of context, perhaps even suggested it was fabricated by those who wanted to destroy their marriage. She skillfully twisted the narrative, accusing Harry of paranoia, of letting outside voices poison his trust. But Harry knew better. He had held the letter in his own hands, seen the familiar script, felt the sting of words only she could have written. No denial could erase the truth he had read. The identity of the lover remained unanswered, but in some ways, that made the betrayal even worse. With no closure, Harry's mind supplied endless suspects, each one plausible, each one another knife in his heart. The lover became a shadowy figure looming over their marriage, a silent presence in every conversation, every glance, every silence between them. And so, Harry's torment deepened. It was not just the words of the letter that broke him. It was the question that would haunt him forever. who had shared in Meghan's laughter at his expense, who had been the secret audience to her confessions of manipulation and control, who was the shadow he could never unmask, the rival he could never confront. That uncertainty became its own prison. It chained Harry to the betrayal, forcing him to relive it over and over without the relief of resolution. The lover in question may never be identified, but the damage was already complete. In Meghan's mocking words, Harry had been reduced to a caricature of weakness. And in the mystery of the man she wrote to, he had been stripped of dignity, forced to live with the possibility that his humiliation was known not only to himself, but to someone else who would always remain unnamed. The cruelest aspect of Meghan's hidden letter was not only the mention of another man or the mocking tone aimed at Harry, but the brutal way she described him as nothing more than a pawn. Her words reinforced a narrative that had long been whispered in both the British press and within palace walls, that Harry had become a puppet, a husband so entranced by his wife's influence that he abandoned his identity and bent himself entirely to her will. The letter did not create this narrative. It confirmed it, and that confirmation crushed Harry far more deeply than the public speculation ever had. From the earliest days of their courtship, observers had noted the changes in Harry. Friends from his army days commented that he laughed less, that he deferred more. In the presence of Meghan, he seemed to fade, content to echo her opinions or stand quietly while she spoke. To the casual eye, it was the behavior of a man devoted to his partner. To those who knew him better, it was the sign of a man surrendering himself piece by piece. Meghan's letter shattered any hope that this was an illusion. She bragged about her ability to control him. She admitted to planting doubts in his mind, pushing him away from his family, and reshaping him into someone she could manage. For Harry, reading this was like watching the past years of his life reframed into a cruel parody where he was not a prince or a partner, but a puppet. The phrase weak and easy to control became his torment. He remembered the many decisions he had made that had been framed as his own, only to now realize how heavily Meghan's hand had guided them. Leaving the royal family, once described as a bold step toward independence, now looked like a carefully orchestrated move designed to isolate him. The bitter interviews, where Harry openly criticized his father and brother, no longer seemed like moments of courage, but rather moments of manipulation, words spoken from his mouth, but seated in Meghan's whispers. The lucrative media deals, the staged appearances, even the public war with the tabloids. Harry began to question how many of those choices were truly his own. What hurt most was that Meghan did not describe this manipulation with shame or guilt. She wrote about it as if it were proof of her cleverness, a triumph of her influence. She presented Harry's loyalty as a flaw, a weakness she could exploit. To her secret confidant, she portrayed herself as the mastermind, the architect of their new life, while Harry was reduced to the role of follower, incapable of standing without her direction. The narrative of Harry as a puppet husband took on a new life outside their walls. Critics who had long accused Meghan of holding sway over Harry found validation in the letter's contents. Commentators on television pointed out moments where Harry's body language seemed subservient, where he looked to Meghan for cues before speaking. Psychologists invited to analyze their dynamic described what they called dependency conditioning, where one partner isolates the other, feeds their insecurities, and creates a bond rooted not in equality, but in control. For Harry, watching these discussions was unbearable. He had always defended Meghan, insisting she was unfairly maligned, only to now face the evidence that those criticisms might have contained truths he refused to see. Friends who had been pushed away began to revisit their final conversations with him. Some recalled warning him that he was losing himself, that he was cutting off the very people who had stood by him during his darkest moments. Harry had dismissed them then, convinced that they did not understand his love for Meghan. But now he saw those warnings for what they were, attempts to save him from exactly the fate he had fallen into. Meghan's letter confirmed that she had encouraged him to see his family as enemies, to distrust their motives, to cast them out of his life, so that her voice would be the only one he heard. The sense of humiliation was overwhelming. Harry, who had once prided himself on his independence, on forging his own path, now realized he had been led down that path by someone who saw him not as a man, but as a tool. He thought of Diana, his mother, and the strength she had shown in standing against a system that often dehumanized her. He had wanted to honor that legacy by protecting Meghan, by ensuring she never endured what Diana had suffered. But now he saw the bitter irony. In trying to protect Meghan, he had allowed himself to be diminished. His fight for freedom had become her proof that she could control him. The puppet husband narrative became his prison. Every public appearance felt like a performance where the world watched to see how Meghan pulled the strings. Every word he spoke was scrutinized for traces of her influence. Harry began to withdraw further, terrified that anything he said would confirm the caricature of him as a man without agency. Yet silence brought no relief. The more he withdrew, the more it appeared that Meghan spoke for both of them, reinforcing the very dynamic the letter had exposed. Behind closed doors, the strain grew unbearable. Confronting Meghan only led to arguments, her denials clashing with the evidence he held in his hands. She accused him of paranoia, of being manipulated by the media, of choosing to believe lies rather than trust her. And Harry, torn between the woman he still loved and the words he had read, found himself trapped in a cycle of confusion and despair. To admit the truth of the letter was to admit that his life had been a lie. To deny it was to accept humiliation willingly. In moments of solitude, he imagined cutting the strings. He thought of returning to his brother, of seeking reconciliation with his father, of reclaiming the identity he had lost. But shame held him back. How could he face them now, after years of defending Meghan and accusing his family of betrayal? How could he admit that they had been right all along? The puppet strings were not just tied by Meghan. They were reinforced by his own pride, his fear of admitting weakness, his unwillingness to say aloud that he had been deceived. The letter did more than expose betrayal. It rewrote Harry's entire life with Meghan into a cruel story of control and manipulation. And in that rewriting, Harry was no longer the bold prince who had chosen love over duty. He was the puppet husband, a man who had given up everything only to discover that he had never truly been the one making choices. The humiliation of that realization broke him in ways the public could never fully understand. When news of Meghan's hidden letter reached the royal household, the reactions were immediate, intense, and varied, ranging from shock and disbelief to quiet, simmering anger. The palace had long been a place of discretion, where public loyalty was maintained at all costs, and private grievances were kept behind closed doors. But this revelation, the exposure of a letter in which Meghan mocked Harry and admitted to manipulating him, shattered the delicate equilibrium. Those closest to Harry were torn between supporting him and grappling with the bitter reality of his entanglement. Queen Elizabeth, always composed in the public eye, was reportedly deeply disturbed. Having navigated decades of royal scandals and family disputes, the Queen understood the gravity of such a document, not just in terms of family dynamics, but in terms of public perception. The notion that a prince, a grandson she had cherished and guided, could be portrayed in such a demeaning light stirred both concern and a sense of helplessness. Advisors noted that the Queen's approach would be measured, seeking to offer support to Harry without escalating a media spectacle. But behind closed doors, her concern was profound. She had witnessed the toll that public scrutiny had taken on Diana, Harry's mother, and feared that the letter's exposure could inflict a similar strain on her grandson. Prince William's reaction was markedly different, mixing anger, disappointment, and disbelief. He had long been wary of the influence Meghan exerted over Harry, a concern that many close to the brothers had shared privately. The letter, with its candid admission that Harry had been manipulated and mocked, appeared to validate those fears. William reportedly struggled with a mixture of sadness for his brother and indignation toward Meghan, feeling that the betrayal was both personal and strategic. In the months following the letter's discovery, William sought to reach out to Harry, attempting to reconnect with his brother, but was met with resistance. The trust between them, once strong, now felt fragile and strained. Other members of the royal family reacted with a mixture of support and caution. Princess Anne, known for her no-nonsense approach, reportedly expressed frustration that Harry had allowed himself to be influenced to such a degree, though she remained sympathetic to the emotional toll it must have taken. Prince Charles, already under intense public scrutiny due to past controversies, found himself conflicted. On one hand, he longed to offer guidance and comfort to his son, Yet he also faced the challenge of addressing the broader narrative that the letter might spark among the public and media. The exposure of Harry's perceived vulnerability threatened not only his personal dignity, but also the reputation of the royal family at large. Palace aides and staff were caught in the crossfire of private reactions and anticipated public fallout. Discussions centered on damage control, both in terms of media strategy and family diplomacy. There was concern that the contents of the letter, if leaked or summarized publicly, could reinforce long-standing narratives about Harry being the weak prince or the puppet husband. For palace communication teams, the priority became controlling the narrative without drawing additional attention, a delicate balance between transparency and discretion that had rarely been tested to this degree. Meanwhile, royal friends and confidants began piecing together the context of the letter, recounting instances where Harry's decisions had seemed unusually influenced by Meghan. Private events, charitable engagements, and even statements made in interviews were revisited under a new lens. What had once appeared to be joint decisions or collaborative planning now took on an altered meaning. Harry's choices were being reframed as orchestrations guided by Meghan's manipulations. This revelation sent ripples through social circles, where former allies quietly reconsidered the prince's autonomy and the dynamics of his relationship. The media, ever vigilant, seized upon the story almost instantly. Though the contents of the letter were largely confidential, rumors began to circulate, fueled by anonymous sources and palace insiders. Headlines hinted at manipulation, secret admissions, and the unraveling of a royal marriage. For the royal family, managing these leaks became a priority, as public perception had the potential to influence everything from international diplomacy to charity work. Advisors worked tirelessly to preempt speculation, offering carefully measured statements and ensuring that family appearances were controlled and supportive. Behind the carefully curated public appearances, the personal toll on Harry was immense. Family dinners, private gatherings, and even casual phone calls carried the weight of the letter's revelations. Every interaction with William, Charles, and other close relatives was shadowed by the knowledge that Harry had been exposed, that his loyalty had been questioned, and that his actions were now scrutinized through a lens of manipulation and control. Emotional support was complicated. Those who wanted to comfort him were acutely aware of the delicate balance between acknowledging his pain and avoiding public exposure. Despite these challenges, a few members of the family rallied in quiet solidarity. Friends reported that some royals sought to remind Harry of his strength, his accomplishments, and the autonomy he still retained despite the manipulation. They encouraged him to reclaim his narrative, to redefine his public persona beyond the contents of the letter. These conversations, while private and limited, offered him some solace, a reminder that the royal family could be a source of support, even amid scandal and betrayal. The psychological impact on Harry cannot be understated. Reading a letter where a partner openly mocked him and claimed control over his decisions introduced feelings of doubt, humiliation, and anger. It became a turning point, forcing him to question not only his relationship, but also his own judgment. He had always prided himself on being independent, on making decisions with moral clarity, yet the letter painted a different picture, one where he had been guided, manipulated, and, in some respects, deceived. This realization was not just a personal blow. It was a moment that reshaped his interactions with family, friends, and the world. In parallel, the family faced the delicate task of addressing the public narrative without undermining Harry further. Public relations experts emphasized strategic appearances, charitable announcements, and controlled interviews to mitigate the potential fallout. They were acutely aware that any misstep could be amplified, turning private pain into global spectacle. At the same time, there was an unspoken understanding among senior family members. The emotional well-being of Harry had to be protected, even as the royal image required careful curation. In essence, the royal family reactions reflected a complex interplay of emotion, strategy, and concern. Shock and disbelief coexisted with empathy and frustration. Anger and protective instincts mingled with fear of public scrutiny. The letter had not only exposed Harry's vulnerabilities, but had also forced the family to confront the intricate dynamics of loyalty, manipulation, and perception. Every conversation, Every meeting, every gesture was now colored by the knowledge that Harry had been manipulated, and that the private truths contained in Meghan's words could reshape both his personal identity and the family's public image. The reverberations of the letter extended beyond the walls of the palace. Advisors, friends, and even international observers recognized that this was not just a marital issue, but a story with profound implications for the monarchy itself. It became a lesson in trust, autonomy, and the consequences of influence within one of the most scrutinized families in the world. And at the heart of it all stood Harry, navigating the turbulent waters of betrayal, public perception, and familial concern, seeking to reclaim not just his narrative, but his sense of self. The tension between Harry and Meghan had been simmering for months, a quiet storm of unspoken grievances, subtle jabs, and misaligned expectations. But the discovery of the hidden letter changed everything. It was no longer a matter of private annoyance or mild frustration. The letter represented a tangible proof of deception, manipulation, and betrayal. For Harry, reading Meghan's candid admissions about orchestrating his decisions, mocking his vulnerabilities, and planning public perceptions like a chess game, was a moment of shocking clarity. It was a moment that demanded confrontation, a reckoning that could no longer be postponed. The confrontation was scheduled one quiet evening in Montecito, in the privacy of their sprawling estate, where every corner had once represented intimacy and shared dreams. The air was thick with anticipation, a mixture of anger, heartbreak, and the uncertainty of what would come next. Harry, aware of the emotional weight he carried, rehearsed his words repeatedly in his mind. He knew that his approach had to be measured, yet firm. This was a conversation about truth, accountability, and the future of their relationship. When Meghan entered the room, the atmosphere shifted instantly. Her smile, once warm and familiar, now appeared guarded, almost rehearsed, as if she sensed the storm that had been building for weeks. Harry's gaze met hers, and for a brief moment, silence filled the space. A silence charged with years of shared history, public scrutiny, and private manipulation. The first words, when they came, were carefully chosen yet unmistakably sharp. Harry's voice, steady but carrying the weight of hurt, cut through the tension. "I read the letter," he began. The simplicity of the statement belied the depth of emotion behind it. Every syllable resonated, a mixture of pain, disappointment, and a demand for honesty. Meghan's reaction was a careful blend of surprise and defensive composure. She had never anticipated that the letter would surface, and certainly not that Harry would confront her so directly. Her initial response was to downplay the significance, to frame her words as misunderstood or taken out of context. But Harry was unwavering. He recounted specific passages, the manipulative language, the admissions of orchestrating his public appearances, and the casual derision of his thoughts and feelings. Each revelation landed like a weight in the room, a physical manifestation of betrayal that neither of them could ignore. The conversation quickly escalated, moving from measured discussion to heated argument. Harry demanded to know why Meghan felt the need to document such candid thoughts and why she had chosen to manipulate him so openly. Meghan, caught between defensiveness and indignation, insisted that her intentions had always been to protect them both, to manage the pressures of public life in a way that Harry could not. But her words rang hollow against the stark reality of the letter, which outlined a deliberate strategy of control and manipulation. As the confrontation unfolded, Harry's emotions ranged from shock to sorrow to anger. The sense of betrayal was compounded by the public nature of their lives. He understood that any misstep in handling the situation could become a spectacle, a narrative weapon wielded by media outlets and critics. Yet in this private moment, all that mattered was the truth between them, the unvarnished reality of their relationship and the choices that had led to this point. He demanded transparency, an acknowledgement of actions, and a commitment to change, or, at the very least, an honest reckoning with the consequences of her behavior. Meghan's demeanor shifted as the conversation progressed. The initial defensiveness gave way to a mixture of frustration and vulnerability, an acknowledgement, however partial, that her actions had caused real harm. She attempted to explain the pressure she had felt, the constant scrutiny, and the sense of isolation that had colored her decisions. She painted a picture of strategic survival, a need to control narratives, and a belief that manipulating appearances was necessary to maintain their security and influence. Yet Harry, while sympathetic to the pressures, remained steadfast. Manipulation and deceit were unacceptable, regardless of the circumstances. The dialogue revealed layers of complexity that had long been simmering beneath the surface. Harry articulated how the manipulation had affected not only his decisions, but his sense of self. The letter, he explained, had made him question every moment, every choice, every gesture he had made in their partnership. It was not merely a betrayal of trust. It was a subversion of his autonomy, a rewriting of his narrative without his consent. Meghan, confronted with the depth of his hurt, struggled to reconcile her intentions with the real impact of her actions. At times, the conversation descended into raw, emotional exchanges. Words were spoken that could not be unsaid, confessions laid bare, and defenses shattered. Harry recounted moments where he had felt controlled or undermined, illustrating the subtle and pervasive ways in which manipulation had seeped into the fabric of their relationship. Meghan responded with a mixture of denial, justification, and occasional admission, revealing the complexity of human behavior when entangled with power, influence, and public scrutiny. The confrontation lasted hours, with intermittent pauses as both attempted to gather composure and clarity. There were moments of near reconciliation, fleeting instances where empathy bridged the divide, but these were consistently overshadowed by the undeniable weight of betrayal. Harry's focus remained on accountability and the preservation of his own sense of integrity. He articulated that moving forward required either radical honesty and change or a reevaluation of the partnership itself. Throughout the evening, the emotional undercurrent was palpable. Harry's demeanor reflected a man grappling with disillusionment, seeking to reclaim agency over his life and decisions. Meghan's responses fluctuated between defensiveness, remorse, and strategic explanation, revealing both the human desire to protect oneself and the profound impact of exposure. The dialogue underscored the intricate interplay between love, loyalty, manipulation, and the demands of public life, elements that had shaped their relationship from the outset. As the night drew on, it became clear that the confrontation would leave lasting consequences. Harry, though emotionally drained, emerged with a renewed understanding of the dynamics at play and a sense of urgency regarding his personal boundaries. Meghan, facing the tangible manifestation of her actions, was forced to confront not just Harry's pain but the broader implications for their public image, their shared responsibilities, and the trust that had been eroded. In the days following the confrontation, both parties reflected on the intensity of the exchange. For Harry, it was a cathartic yet sobering experience, a moment that crystallized the challenges of balancing love, loyalty, and autonomy. For Meghan, it represented a reckoning, an opportunity to reassess strategies, intentions, and the human cost of manipulation. The confrontation did not resolve every issue, but it set the stage for a transformation, an acknowledgement that truth, honesty, and respect were indispensable foundations for any path forward. The episode became a turning point in their relationship, a vivid illustration of how private actions could reverberate through the most public of lives. It underscored the fragility of trust, the complexity of power dynamics, and the necessity of confronting uncomfortable truths. Harry's insistence on accountability and Meghan's forced reckoning marked a critical chapter in their story, one that would influence not only their partnership, but also the perception of their roles within the royal framework and the public consciousness. This confrontation, private yet pivotal, exemplified the intricate dance of emotion, strategy, and human behavior in the spotlight. It revealed the consequences of deception, the resilience required to assert personal integrity, and the enduring impact of choices made behind closed doors. For Harry, it was a step toward reclaiming control over his narrative, his autonomy, and his sense of self, a moment that would resonate far beyond the walls of Montecito. The tension that had once simmered behind the walls of Montecito now began to spill into the public sphere. Harry's confrontation with Meghan had left indelible marks, but it was the subsequent exposure of her actions that transformed private discord into a story with global consequences. What started as a personal reckoning quickly escalated into a spectacle, a narrative fueled by social media leaks, anonymous tips to journalists, and the relentless machinery of the press. For Harry, the prospect of public scrutiny was daunting, but necessary. He knew that the truth could not remain hidden, that the manipulation outlined in the letter demanded acknowledgement, both to reclaim his agency and to prevent further misrepresentation. The first sign of exposure came unexpectedly. A photograph, seemingly innocuous, appeared on a tabloid website, showing Meghan in a discreet meeting with an unknown intermediary outside a high-end jewelry store. The image captured her smiling, carrying a small velvet bag, her posture casual but purposeful. While many dismissed it as a routine outing, those who knew the context, the private exchanges, the conversations Harry had unearthed, recognized it as far more significant. It was not merely a meeting. It was evidence of actions that contradicted Meghan's public persona. This photograph would become the cornerstone of an unfolding scandal, a visual testament to a narrative she had tried to control but could no longer contain. Journalists began connecting dots with astonishing speed. Reports surfaced suggesting that Meghan had been involved in selling a portion of Princess Diana's jewelry collection, pieces that were not hers to distribute. Sources cited whispered accounts from employees, associates, and even former palace staff, all of whom claimed to have witnessed unusual activity. Packages arriving at private residences, discreet sales meetings, and exchanges that appeared highly coordinated. The media frenzy intensified when someone leaked the letter Harry had confronted Meghan about, providing direct insight into her strategic thinking, her admissions of manipulation, and her plans for controlling public perception. The combination of photographic evidence, insider accounts, and written documentation created an undeniable narrative that could no longer be ignored. Harry, acutely aware of the inevitability of exposure, took swift action. He issued a carefully crafted statement acknowledging the situation, emphasizing the importance of transparency, and signaling that he would cooperate fully with any investigations. The statement, though measured, carried the weight of personal accountability and moral authority. Harry knew that public perception was a double-edged sword. He could either allow misinformation to dominate or assert control by presenting a credible, coherent version of events. The decision to confront the issue head-on reflected his understanding of the stakes, not just for himself, but for the legacy of the royal family and the integrity of his public role. The release of the statement triggered a firestorm of reactions. Social media platforms erupted with speculation, analysis, and judgment. Hashtags related to the scandal trended globally, as both supporters and critics weighed in. News networks ran round-the-clock coverage, dissecting every element of the story, the photograph, the leaked letter, and Harry's public response. Commentators debated the ethical implications of selling Diana's jewelry, the dynamics of manipulation within high-profile relationships, and the broader consequences for the monarchy. The narrative evolved rapidly, with new details emerging daily, each revelation adding layers of complexity and heightening public interest. As the exposure intensified, Meghan's response became increasingly defensive. In carefully curated statements, she attempted to frame the situation as misinterpreted or exaggerated, portraying herself as a victim of media sensationalism and misunderstanding. Yet the evidence against her was compelling. Photographs, witness accounts, and the contents of the letter presented a consistent narrative that challenged her public explanations. Every attempt at spin was met with skepticism, further eroding credibility. Analysts noted that her strategy, once aimed at controlling perception, had backfired spectacularly, amplifying scrutiny and undermining public trust. The legal implications also began to surface. Questions arose regarding the ownership of Diana's jewelry, the legitimacy of any transactions, and potential breaches of trust or estate management. Legal experts speculated on the ramifications, noting that private sales of high-value items without consent could constitute serious violations, including potential civil litigation or criminal inquiry. Harry consulted with advisors, carefully considering every move to protect both personal and familial interests, while simultaneously allowing the facts to emerge transparently. The intersection of public exposure and legal scrutiny added a layer of urgency and gravity to an already volatile situation. Amidst the media frenzy, the human dimension of the scandal became apparent. Former aides and insiders described the emotional toll on Harry, recounting sleepless nights, intense stress, and moments of despair. Friends of Meghan noted her visible anxiety, her attempts to manage a narrative that was rapidly spiraling beyond control, and her growing frustration with the relentless attention. Both parties were navigating not only a public relations crisis, but a deeply personal reckoning, one that exposed vulnerabilities, strained relationships, and tested resilience. The public exposure also had cultural implications. Discussions proliferated regarding the role of the media in scrutinizing the lives of public figures, the ethics of privacy invasion, and the accountability of those entrusted with family legacies. Opinion pieces, interviews, and panel discussions debated the balance between celebrity freedom and moral responsibility, using Meghan's actions as a case study. The global audience, invested in the saga, engaged in fervent debate, analyzing motives, consequences, and the interplay of wealth, power, and public expectation. The scandal transcended the personal, entering the realm of societal discourse on trust, morality, and transparency. As days turned into weeks, the story continued to evolve. Investigative journalists uncovered additional layers, including purported communications between Meghan and intermediaries, attempts to negotiate private sales discreetly, and financial records that hinted at complex transactions. Each revelation fed public fascination, while simultaneously raising questions about accountability, loyalty, and the integrity of personal and familial bonds. The combination of visual evidence, insider testimony, and written documentation created a narrative of unprecedented clarity, leaving little room for denial or misrepresentation. Harry, increasingly resolute, focused on controlling the narrative with dignity and clarity. He participated in selective interviews, provided verified documentation, and engaged directly with reputable journalists to ensure accuracy. His strategy was deliberate. Rather than engaging in reactive statements, he aimed to establish a factual record, provide context, and demonstrate accountability. Analysts noted that his approach contrasted sharply with Meghan's defensive posture, highlighting a stark divergence in crisis management strategies. The public exposure inevitably affected broader social dynamics. High-profile supporters, charitable partners, and even members of the royal circle re-evaluated their relationships, considering both ethical and reputational consequences. Invitations were rescinded, collaborations paused, and endorsements reconsidered. The ripple effects extended beyond Montecito, influencing perceptions in the United Kingdom, the United States, and internationally. Every public appearance, statement, or social media post was scrutinized, reinforcing the high stakes of the unfolding drama. Media outlets published detailed timelines of events, juxtaposing Harry's confrontation, the leaked letter, and Meghan's documented actions. Analysis focused on patterns of behavior, strategic intent, and ethical considerations. The global audience engaged actively, dissecting motives, debating consequences, and drawing comparisons to other public scandals. The exposure created a narrative that was not only newsworthy but deeply resonant, touching on themes of manipulation, betrayal, power, and personal agency. In the midst of the scrutiny, Harry's determination to reclaim his story became evident. He emphasized the importance of truth, transparency, and personal accountability, signaling a commitment to integrity despite the intense pressure. Public support for his position grew, with commentators praising his measured approach and insistence on factual accuracy. Simultaneously, the exposure forced Meghan to confront the tangible consequences of her actions, both legally and reputationally, creating a scenario in which denial or obfuscation was no longer viable. The convergence of private conflict and public exposure illustrated the inescapable reality of life in the global spotlight. Harry's confrontation, once confined to Montecito, had ignited a worldwide conversation, exposing the intricacies of personal relationships, the ethical dimensions of public conduct, and the power of documented evidence. The story underscored the importance of accountability, transparency, and the profound impact of choices, revealing that private actions, when brought to light, can reshape public perception and alter the course of personal and familial legacies. As the chapter of public exposure unfolded, it became clear that the consequences would be long-lasting. The scandal reshaped relationships, influenced public opinion, and challenged traditional notions of privacy, trust, and integrity within high-profile families. For Harry, it represented a reclaiming of agency and a commitment to truth. For Meghan, it signaled the necessity of confronting the real-world implications of decisions that were once intended to manipulate perception. The public exposure was not merely a revelation. It was a turning point, a moment in which private actions collided with global scrutiny, leaving an indelible mark on all involved. The episode highlighted the delicate balance between personal ambition and ethical responsibility, demonstrating that no strategy of concealment can withstand the convergence of evidence, accountability, and public interest. It also illustrated the enduring power of transparency, showing that even amidst scandal, integrity and honesty remain critical foundations for navigating both personal and public crises. As Montecito became the epicenter of revelation, the story of Harry and Meghan's confrontation and subsequent exposure served as a cautionary tale, a study in human behavior, strategic miscalculation, and the inescapable reach of truth. The aftermath of the public exposure reverberated across multiple spheres: personal, social, legal, and international. For Harry, the fallout was a mixture of vindication and burden. Vindication, because the truth he had fought to uncover had now reached the world, dismantling the curated narrative Meghan had attempted to maintain. Burden, because the revelation had unleashed a torrent of scrutiny, judgment, and speculation that could not be contained. The scandal, once private, had grown into a global phenomenon, sparking debates, investigations, and intense media coverage. Every interaction, every statement, and every social media post became material for analysis, making it impossible for either Harry or Meghan to operate without constant observation. In the immediate weeks following the exposure, Harry focused on stabilizing his public image while managing personal repercussions. He held private meetings with advisors, family members, and trusted friends, meticulously planning each step. The first priority was ensuring clarity and consistency in his messaging. Unlike Meghan, whose attempts at controlling perception had faltered, Harry adopted a disciplined approach, carefully navigating the labyrinth of media outlets, interviews, and social commentary. Each statement was strategic, emphasizing transparency, accountability, and factual accuracy. Analysts observed that this methodical approach began to restore public trust in his judgment and integrity, framing him as a figure who, despite personal betrayal, remained steadfast and principled. The social repercussions were equally significant. Within royal circles, the scandal sparked tension and recalibration of alliances. Some members expressed shock, dismay, and frustration, concerned about the broader implications for family reputation. Others, who had privately harbored doubts or observed inconsistencies in Meghan's behavior, felt a sense of validation, seeing their concerns confirmed through the evidence and documentation released. Gossip networks, informal channels of communication, and trusted aides began to share their perspectives, revealing the extent to which Meghan's actions had unsettled not only Harry but the larger familial network. These reactions, though unofficial, contributed to a shifting dynamic within the family, highlighting fractured loyalties and a reevaluation of personal and professional relationships. Public opinion evolved rapidly. Surveys, online polls, and social media sentiment analyses reflected a growing acknowledgement of Harry's position and actions. Whereas Meghan had previously cultivated a sympathetic narrative portraying herself as a victim of media intrusion, the exposure reframed the discourse. People began questioning the authenticity of her claims, scrutinizing her motives, and evaluating the tangible evidence of her alleged manipulation. This shift in perception had significant consequences. It influenced how journalists framed the story, altered editorial decisions, and prompted a wave of investigative reporting into related matters, from financial transactions to interpersonal communications. Every revelation compounded the previous, creating a cumulative effect that intensified scrutiny and widened the scope of the fallout. Legal ramifications began to emerge almost immediately. Questions regarding the ownership and sale of Princess Diana's jewelry escalated into formal inquiries. Estate lawyers, appraisers, and legal experts reviewed documentation, assessed provenance, and evaluated compliance with regulations governing inheritance and high-value transactions. While no definitive charges were immediately filed, the potential for civil litigation, financial restitution, and reputational penalties loomed large. Harry's advisors emphasized prudence, encouraging him to collaborate with legal authorities to demonstrate good faith, ensure transparency, and safeguard his personal and familial interests. This proactive approach aimed not only to mitigate legal risk, but also to reinforce public perception of integrity and responsibility. The professional sphere also felt the repercussions. Meghan's business engagements, partnerships, and media projects were scrutinized, with several sponsors and collaborators re-evaluating their associations. Contracts were renegotiated, sponsorships paused, and public endorsements withdrawn. Companies, conscious of potential reputational damage, sought to distance themselves from controversy, even as Meghan attempted to maintain appearances of normalcy. This professional fallout underscored the high stakes of public exposure and the tangible consequences of actions perceived as unethical or manipulative. Every contract, every partnership became a test of credibility and trustworthiness, further amplifying the ripple effects of the scandal. Social media served as both a catalyst and an amplifier. Memes, threads, and commentaries circulated rapidly, spreading interpretations, assumptions, and speculation to millions. The viral nature of the content ensured that the scandal reached diverse audiences across the globe, from casual observers to die-hard royal watchers. Hashtags related to the incident dominated trends, fueling discussions about morality, transparency, and the responsibilities of public figures. Engagements were intense and immediate, reflecting society's fascination with celebrity scandal and the appetite for detailed narrative dissection. For Harry, managing this landscape required both strategic communication and selective silence, balancing visibility with discretion to prevent misinterpretation or escalation. The personal toll on Harry was profound. Emotional exhaustion, stress, and the constant presence of public scrutiny created an environment of relentless pressure. Friends and advisors described nights spent reviewing documentation, strategizing responses, and preparing for potential scenarios. Psychologists noted the strain of managing simultaneous personal betrayal, media exposure, and legal uncertainty. Despite this, Harry demonstrated resilience, drawing on a network of trusted confidants and a clear sense of purpose to navigate the storm. His focus remained on factual clarity, ethical responsibility, and maintaining composure under intense global observation. Meghan, conversely, experienced escalating pressure. Attempts to control the narrative through statements and selective media engagements repeatedly failed to gain traction against the overwhelming evidence of her actions. Advisors reportedly cautioned against confrontational messaging, noting that public perception was increasingly unfavorable. Social isolation compounded the challenge, as former allies distanced themselves and collaborators reconsidered professional ties. The psychological and emotional impact became evident, manifesting in visible frustration, erratic communication strategies, and heightened defensiveness. Observers described a woman grappling with consequences far beyond the scope of initial expectations, facing the stark reality of public accountability and reputational damage. The media landscape reflected a transformation in coverage. News outlets shifted from speculative commentary to detailed investigative reporting, analyzing documents, communications, and corroborating witness accounts. Headlines emphasized factual revelations, timelines of events, and expert analysis, reflecting a move from sensationalism to substantive scrutiny. Opinion columns debated ethical considerations, the responsibilities of public figures, and the intersection of private actions with public consequences. Legal experts contributed analysis on potential litigation, while cultural commentators explored the broader implications for societal trust, privacy, and morality in high-profile relationships. The comprehensive nature of this coverage ensured that the fallout permeated multiple levels of discourse, from casual social media interactions to formal editorial evaluations. The global audience remained intensely engaged. International news agencies tracked developments, translating reports for diverse audiences and framing the scandal within broader cultural and social contexts. Commentary spanned continents, connecting events in Montecito to historical precedents in the British monarchy, celebrity behavior, and legal frameworks governing inheritance and estate management. Audiences debated motives, consequences, and ethical considerations, creating a sustained narrative thread that extended beyond traditional news cycles. This global attention magnified the stakes, reinforcing the enduring impact of the exposure and shaping perceptions across multiple cultural and social spheres. The fallout extended into philanthropic and charitable domains. Organizations previously associated with Harry and Meghan evaluated their involvement in light of the scandal, considering both ethical alignment and reputational risk. Some paused donations, others sought clarification on involvement, and a few publicly distanced themselves. Harry, attentive to these implications, ensured transparency in communications with charitable partners, emphasizing factual accuracy and commitment to integrity. This approach helped preserve essential relationships and mitigate potential damage to philanthropic efforts, underscoring the broader consequences of personal actions on professional and social responsibilities. Financial repercussions were also significant. Analysis of Meghan's assets, transactions, and business dealings intensified, with auditors and investigative journalists tracking patterns of expenditure, asset transfers, and income sources. Discussions of financial accountability, potential restitution, and compliance with legal obligations became central to public discourse. Harry's careful documentation and transparency contrasted with Meghan's attempts to manage perception, reinforcing divergent approaches to accountability and risk management. This financial scrutiny added complexity to the fallout, influencing both public perception and potential legal outcomes. Amidst the unfolding chaos, personal relationships continued to shift. Friends, confidants, and family members navigated the consequences of exposure, reassessing alliances, offering support, or distancing themselves. These dynamics, though often subtle, reflected deeper currents of trust, loyalty, and judgment. Observers noted that the scandal not only revealed behavior, but also tested the resilience of social bonds, highlighting the intricate interplay between personal decisions, ethical responsibility, and relational consequences. By the end of the initial wave of fallout, it became evident that the repercussions were enduring. Harry had successfully asserted transparency, credibility, and ethical responsibility, strengthening public perception of his integrity. Meghan, facing a convergence of legal, social, and professional consequences, confronted the tangible impact of actions once intended to control perception. The events demonstrated the interplay of personal decisions, public exposure, and global scrutiny, creating a narrative with enduring implications for both parties. The fallout from Montecito underscored the inescapable reality that private actions, when exposed, generate complex and far-reaching consequences. For Harry, it was a reaffirmation of ethical accountability and strategic clarity. For Meghan, it was a confrontation with the tangible outcomes of miscalculated strategy and manipulation. The world had witnessed not merely a personal scandal, but a broader lesson in transparency, integrity, and the enduring consequences of choices made in both private and public spheres. The episode revealed that reputational, legal, and emotional consequences are rarely isolated. Every decision, interaction, and strategy carried weight, shaping outcomes across personal, professional, and societal dimensions. As the fallout continued to evolve, it became clear that the events in Montecito would remain a defining moment. An instructive, cautionary tale highlighting the profound impact of exposure, accountability, and the intricate dynamics of power, perception, and human behavior. The moment news of Meghan's alleged sale of Diana's jewelry collection became public, the media machine went into overdrive. It was a perfect storm, a high-profile royal, allegations of betrayal and greed, and an emotional connection to Princess Diana, one of the most beloved figures in modern history. Headlines erupted across tabloids, digital platforms, and social media, creating a non-stop barrage of coverage that left little room for nuance. From Los Angeles to London, journalists scrambled to secure commentary, leaks, and analysis, ensuring that the story dominated both traditional and digital news cycles. Every channel, every outlet, and every online commentator seemed determined to dissect, critique, and sensationalize the events that had unfolded in Montecito. The initial reporting was dominated by vivid imagery and emotional language. Paparazzi photos of Meghan leaving her estate, legal documents pertaining to the jewelry, and images of Harry's reaction circulated relentlessly, often accompanied by speculative captions suggesting betrayal, manipulation, or financial desperation. News outlets framed the story as a dramatic revelation, emphasizing the contrast between Meghan's carefully curated public persona and the reality that the world now saw. Headlines screamed about broken trust, alleged deception, and shocking family betrayal, reinforcing a narrative of scandal that captivated readers and viewers alike. Social media amplified these reports exponentially, with hashtags trending for days and millions engaging in discussions, debates, and arguments about the legitimacy of the claims and the morality of the alleged actions. Commentators from across the globe weighed in, creating a cacophony of opinion that further fueled public judgment. Television talk shows hosted panels of experts, royal correspondents, and cultural analysts who dissected the implications of the alleged jewelry sale. Some emphasized legal ramifications, speculating on potential lawsuits, estate violations, and breaches of trust. Others focused on ethical considerations, debating whether Meghan's actions were motivated by personal gain, necessity, or misjudgment. The discussion extended to broader themes, including the pressures of royal life, the impact of media scrutiny, and the consequences of living in the public eye. Each viewpoint contributed to a complex, multifaceted narrative, blurring lines between fact, opinion, and conjecture. Social media platforms became a battleground for public sentiment. Millions of users shared their reactions, creating a mix of outrage, sympathy, ridicule, and fascination. Memes proliferated, satirical posts circulated widely, and threads dissected every publicly available detail. The discourse was relentless, and while some defended Meghan, many questioned her motives, scrutinized her past actions, and debated her credibility. Viral moments, such as a short clip of Meghan adjusting her hair before a paparazzi photo op or a leaked statement from a former staff member, were dissected, analyzed, and repurposed endlessly, creating a sense that every move she made was under microscopic evaluation. The intensity of social media engagement amplified the pressure on both Meghan and Harry, leaving little space for private deliberation or thoughtful response. Traditional print media, while slightly more measured, still contributed to the frenzy. Articles traced the history of Princess Diana's jewelry, explored the implications of selling inherited items, and provided detailed background on the Montecito residence and the couple's public image. Feature pieces included interviews with royal experts, former staff, and insiders, each offering context or speculation, ensuring that readers received a mixture of analysis and conjecture. These stories often emphasize the emotional weight of the alleged sale, highlighting how Diana's legacy, once untouchable, was now enmeshed in a web of scandal. Newspapers in London framed the event within a historical context, comparing Meghan's actions with past royal controversies, while American outlets focused on the drama and spectacle, highlighting human interest elements and celebrity culture narratives. Media outlets also explored the psychological and interpersonal dimensions of the scandal. Analysts discussed potential motivations behind Meghan's alleged actions, exploring theories of financial stress, ambition, and emotional detachment. Profiles emerged that dissected her personality, career trajectory, and public statements, juxtaposing her past philanthropic endeavors with the controversial sale of the jewelry. Experts in media psychology and celebrity culture debated whether public perception had been manipulated or if the exposure represented an unavoidable consequence of living in the public eye. The coverage created a narrative that extended beyond the immediate scandal, questioning values, ethics, and the very nature of celebrity accountability. Harry's role in the media narrative was equally complex. While the exposure had cast Meghan in a critical light, Harry's response became a focal point for commentary. Journalists and commentators scrutinized his emotional state, public appearances, and statements, analyzing whether his actions demonstrated moral clarity, loyalty, or calculated damage control. The public witnessed Harry navigating a delicate balance, asserting his position, protecting family legacy, and managing the media spectacle. Every gesture, from press statements to social media posts, was analyzed for authenticity, intent, and emotional resonance, illustrating how high-profile exposure magnifies the consequences of personal behavior. Public judgment extended beyond commentary to social behavior and engagement. Online petitions, discussion forums, and comment threads allowed ordinary citizens to weigh in, often passionately. Many expressed outrage, equating the alleged sale with disrespect toward Princess Diana's memory. Others offered empathy, suggesting that public scrutiny and media manipulation may have influenced Meghan's decisions. Influencers, celebrities, and high-profile figures added their voices, amplifying visibility and influencing sentiment. Their opinions, shared with millions of followers, created ripple effects across social media, shaping perceptions and reinforcing the narrative constructed by mainstream media. Legal experts contributed another layer to the media frenzy. Analysts speculated on potential ramifications related to inheritance law, international jurisdiction, and financial accountability. Legal commentators highlighted how public exposure could affect negotiations, settlements, and reputational risk. Media outlets reported on the meticulous tracking of assets, documentation of transactions, and potential implications for estate trustees and royal advisors. This dimension of coverage added gravitas to the story, emphasizing that the consequences extended beyond emotion and perception, potentially implicating financial, legal, and regulatory frameworks. Cultural commentators explored broader implications, including the interplay of gender, power, and celebrity in royal narratives. Articles examined how Meghan's actions were perceived differently because of her gender, her position as a non-native royal, and her visibility in global media. Discussions highlighted societal expectations, assumptions about morality, and the challenges faced by individuals navigating complex social and cultural landscapes. These analyses provided context for the intensity of public judgment, illustrating how perceptions of wrongdoing were influenced by pre-existing narratives, biases, and expectations surrounding Meghan as a public figure. The media frenzy also affected public discourse surrounding privacy and media ethics. Critics argued that relentless coverage, speculation, and social amplification created an environment where personal mistakes were magnified into global spectacles. Debates emerged about the responsibilities of journalists, paparazzi, and social media platforms in shaping narratives, influencing public perception, and amplifying personal crises. These discussions underscored the tension between public interest and personal privacy, highlighting the complex ethical terrain navigated by both media organizations and those in the public eye. Amid the storm, Harry maintained a measured approach to media engagement. Rather than reacting impulsively, he leveraged carefully selected interviews, public statements, and legal channels to assert factual clarity and counter misinformation. His strategy emphasized transparency, integrity, and factual accuracy, presenting a contrast to the sensationalism dominating headlines. Analysts noted that this approach gradually reshaped public sentiment, highlighting the importance of strategic communication in high-stakes media environments. The role of investigative journalism became central. News organizations deployed resources to verify claims, analyze documents, and corroborate witness statements. Exclusive reports, leaked communications, and in-depth analysis added layers of evidence that reinforced the narrative of exposure. Each verified detail strengthened the story's credibility, compelling audiences to engage critically and reassess previously held assumptions. This comprehensive approach elevated the discourse, moving it from speculation to documented analysis, creating a lasting record of events for both public and historical consideration. Celebrity culture further magnified the intensity of the coverage. Meghan's status as a global figure attracted attention from entertainment media, fashion critics, and lifestyle commentators. Every detail, from wardrobe choices to body language, was scrutinized, often interpreted as reflective of personal guilt, anxiety, or defiance. Paparazzi photographs, carefully timed social media posts, and appearances at public events became material for analysis, reinforcing the narrative that Meghan's actions had consequences far beyond the private realm. The interplay between celebrity and scandal created a dynamic where perception often equaled reality, shaping judgments in ways that were immediate, emotional, and highly visible. Global audiences reacted with a mixture of fascination, moral evaluation, and emotional investment. Forums across continents debated ethical responsibility, loyalty, and integrity, drawing comparisons to historical scandals within the monarchy and celebrity culture. Online platforms became arenas for dialogue, argument, and judgment, with millions contributing to the evolving narrative. This widespread engagement reflected not only interest in royal affairs, but also a broader human fascination with the intersection of power, privilege, and personal choice. Throughout the media frenzy, the impact on Meghan's public image became increasingly evident. The exposure of alleged actions disrupted carefully cultivated narratives, prompting reevaluation by sponsors, collaborators, and audiences. The cumulative effect of continuous reporting, social media amplification, and public scrutiny exerted pressure on her professional, social, and personal standing. Analysts noted that in such high-visibility cases, recovery required sustained transparency, consistent messaging, and demonstrable accountability, strategies that were challenging to implement amidst ongoing scrutiny. Harry's media strategy, in contrast, emphasized measured transparency. By providing selective insight, corroborating evidence, and carefully framed statements, he positioned himself as a figure navigating crisis with ethical clarity and factual precision. Public perception began to shift subtly, recognizing the disparity between his deliberate approach and the chaos surrounding Meghan's narrative. This distinction influenced media coverage, public commentary, and social media sentiment, highlighting the critical role of strategic communication in managing high-stakes exposure. The aftermath of the Montecito jewelry scandal rippled far beyond media headlines and social media commentary. Within the walls of royal circles, the incident triggered an unprecedented wave of tension, scrutiny, and personal reckoning. While Harry and Meghan's public images were being debated across platforms and publications, the private consequences were far more severe, touching the core of family relationships and the delicate balance of the monarchy. The once unshakable image of unity and decorum within the royal family began to show cracks, as trust, loyalty, and reputation were called into question. For King Charles, the news struck like a thunderclap. He had long attempted to navigate the complex dynamics between Harry, Meghan, and the rest of the family, maintaining a delicate equilibrium of support, guidance, and diplomatic oversight. However, the exposure of Meghan's alleged actions regarding Diana's jewelry collection forced him to confront an uncomfortable reality. One of his grandchildren's spouses had engaged in behavior that could be interpreted as exploitative and potentially damaging to the family legacy. Advisors rushed to brief him on legal implications, public relations strategies, and potential political fallout, knowing that any misstep could amplify criticism from both the public and the media. The king's reaction was reportedly a mixture of disappointment, strategic calculation, and personal sorrow, as he weighed familial loyalty against the need to safeguard the monarchy's reputation. Prince William and Catherine, meanwhile, found themselves navigating a separate set of tensions. Although geographically distant from Montecito, they were deeply attuned to the developments and understood that public perception would inevitably connect them to the scandal by virtue of family association. William, often regarded as the stabilizing force within the younger generation of royals, reportedly expressed frustration over the perceived recklessness of Meghan's actions. For him, the situation was not just about media narratives. It touched on the preservation of family integrity, the responsibilities tied to royal heritage, and the protection of Diana's legacy. Catherine, known for her measured composure and strategic social awareness, offered counsel on public messaging, charitable alignment, and damage control, recognizing the intricate web of optics that would define public understanding of the incident. The younger royals were also affected. Princess Charlotte and Prince George were shielded from direct exposure, but were nonetheless aware of the heightened scrutiny surrounding their family. Courtiers and staff members took special measures to maintain their routine, emphasizing normalcy amidst the chaos. At the same time, internal discussions among advisors, aides, and security personnel intensified, as the potential for media intrusion, public questioning, and paparazzi attention became an ever-present concern. The family collectively faced a challenge of maintaining internal unity while managing external pressures that threatened to fracture relationships. Private correspondence between family members reportedly became increasingly guarded. Texts, emails, and calls between Harry and his relatives grew tense, with attempts to reconcile, explain, or defend positions often met with resistance or skepticism. Rumors of ultimatums and confrontations circulated among palace insiders, suggesting that the scandal had created rifts not easily mended. One particularly sensitive point was the intersection of personal loyalty and institutional responsibility. Harry's protective instincts toward Meghan conflicted with the monarchy's need to uphold ethical standards and preserve its legacy, creating an emotional tug-of-war that strained relationships on multiple levels. The Queen's extended network of advisors, from senior courtiers to private legal counsel, reportedly convened emergency consultations to assess the potential fallout. Discussions ranged from asset protection, trust oversight, and estate management to crisis communication strategies aimed at limiting reputational damage. The urgency of these meetings highlighted the severity of the situation. The alleged sale of Diana's jewelry collection was not merely a personal family matter, but a crisis with historical, cultural, and financial ramifications that could reverberate for years. Courtiers debated options such as public statements, private mediation, or even legal action, balancing the need for confidentiality with the unavoidable scrutiny of global media. Harry himself found the situation increasingly challenging. Torn between loyalty to Meghan and a desire to preserve family cohesion, he reportedly faced sleepless nights, anxiety, and mounting frustration. Counsel from trusted friends and advisors urged him to act strategically, yet emotionally he remained deeply invested in protecting Meghan from what he perceived as unjust vilification. Public appearances became carefully choreographed performances, where every gesture, glance, and statement was analyzed for signs of anger, remorse, or defensiveness. Observers noted that Harry's demeanor seemed both protective and weary, reflecting the immense personal toll exacted by the crisis. Meghan, on the other hand, experienced a whirlwind of pressure from multiple fronts. Beyond media scrutiny, she confronted legal advisors, financial consultants, and personal confidants who all emphasized the need for careful navigation. The emotional burden of being publicly accused of exploiting Diana's legacy reportedly weighed heavily, intensifying existing tensions with her spouse and the broader royal family. Accounts from close aides suggest that Meghan oscillated between assertive defense of her actions and moments of private doubt, reflecting the complexity of managing personal ambition, public expectation, and historical legacy simultaneously. The legal dimension of the fallout became increasingly prominent. Lawyers specializing in estate law, inheritance disputes, and royal protocols were consulted to assess the validity of the allegations, potential repercussions for both Meghan and Harry, and strategies for mitigation. Every detail, from documentation of jewelry provenance to the legitimacy of potential sales agreements, was scrutinized. Internal investigations were launched to determine whether procedural breaches occurred and what corrective measures were necessary. Advisors recommended detailed records, careful communication with trustees, and proactive disclosure of relevant information to preempt further public speculation. The legal framework became intertwined with emotional and reputational considerations, highlighting the multi-layered nature of the crisis. Family tensions manifested in private confrontations that reportedly lasted hours. Discussions centered not only on the alleged jewelry sale, but also on larger questions of trust, communication, and loyalty. Emotional appeals were made on all sides. Harry sought understanding from Meghan's perspective, while senior royals emphasized the gravity of the public and historical implications. The emotional weight of these conversations was palpable, often leaving participants drained and unsettled. Courtiers described the situation as unprecedented in recent memory, noting that even long-standing family disagreements typically lacked such intensity and public visibility. The impact on international perception of the royal family was immediate. Diplomatic observers, cultural commentators, and global media analyzed the situation for signs of weakness, internal conflict, and potential vulnerabilities. Opinion pieces debated the monarchy's response, assessing whether the family would demonstrate discipline, forgiveness, or strategic distancing. Analysts highlighted the delicate balance between familial loyalty and institutional responsibility, noting that the royal family's handling of the crisis could influence public trust, charitable engagement, and historical reputation for generations. Amid the internal turbulence, Harry and Meghan attempted to maintain a semblance of normalcy. Public appearances were minimized, charitable initiatives continued under careful scrutiny, and social media engagement was selectively managed. Every step was calculated to preserve image while navigating the aftermath of the scandal. Despite these efforts, tensions remained high, as external judgment and internal disappointment created an environment fraught with pressure, uncertainty, and emotional strain. Insiders reported that reconciliation efforts were tentative and fragile. Apologies, explanations, and assurances were exchanged, but mutual understanding was often difficult to achieve. Harry and Meghan's perspective was rooted in perceived loyalty and personal freedom, while senior royals emphasized duty, legacy, and ethical responsibility. These differing priorities created friction, requiring mediation from trusted intermediaries and careful timing of communication to avoid further escalation. The fallout extended beyond the immediate family. Staff members, advisors, and household employees became acutely aware of the stakes, navigating their roles with heightened vigilance. Trust, discretion, and loyalty were tested daily, as even minor missteps could have outsized consequences. The environment was described by insiders as tense, introspective, and strategic, reflecting a collective understanding that the incident had reshaped relationships, expectations, and responsibilities across the household. International press coverage continued to influence family dynamics. Every statement, denial, or clarification was amplified globally, often outpacing internal communications and creating challenges for accurate representation. Rumors of private confrontations, emotional exchanges, and legal deliberations circulated widely, further complicating the management of internal family relations. The family's approach required balancing transparency with confidentiality, public perception with private sentiment, and strategic action with emotional care. Meanwhile, public opinion remained a volatile factor. Polls, commentary, and social media metrics tracked the fluctuating perception of Harry, Meghan, and the broader family. Reputation management teams analyzed sentiment trends, identifying areas of concern, potential damage, and opportunities for narrative correction. These insights informed strategic decisions on public messaging, charitable involvement, and selective appearances, emphasizing the interconnection between public perception and internal family cohesion. The intersection of personal loyalty, institutional responsibility, and historical legacy defined the complexity of the fallout. Each decision carried consequences not only for immediate family relationships, but also for the broader perception of the monarchy. Harry's protective instincts, Meghan's defense of personal agency, and senior royals' commitment to legacy and duty created a multidimensional web of tension, negotiation, and emotional negotiation. As weeks turned into months, efforts toward resolution evolved. Mediation sessions, strategic communication planning, and legal assessments continued, reflecting the recognition that restoring trust and stabilizing relationships required sustained, deliberate effort. The Montecito jewelry scandal was no longer just a media event. It had become a catalyst for deep reflection, internal recalibration, and long-term planning within one of the world's most scrutinized families. The chapter of royal fallout underscored that high-profile scandals operate on multiple levels: emotional, legal, reputational, and historical. Each dimension carries weight, influencing relationships, public perception, and the legacy of those involved. For Harry and Meghan, the path forward demanded strategic foresight, emotional resilience, and careful negotiation, as the monarchy sought to navigate the treacherous waters of betrayal, media scrutiny, and familial tension. The episode served as a stark reminder that in the life of royals, personal decisions are inseparable from public consequence and the echoes. As news of the Montecito jewelry scandal broke, the global media erupted in a frenzy, creating an unprecedented storm of attention, speculation, and controversy. Headlines dominated not only newspapers and online publications, but also social media platforms, television broadcasts, and radio segments, all dissecting every detail of the story. For many, the scandal represented the ultimate breach of trust, exploiting Princess Diana's legacy for personal gain, and it provoked strong reactions across demographics and geographies. Analysts noted that the story had a rare combination of elements: royal intrigue, celebrity involvement, historical significance, and allegations of betrayal. The combination proved irresistible to audiences worldwide, ensuring continuous coverage and discussion. Within hours of the story's release, Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook were flooded with hashtags and trending topics relating to Meghan Markle, Prince Harry, and the sale of Diana's jewelry. Opinion pieces, meme accounts, and amateur sleuths dissected the allegations, attempting to interpret photographs, video clips, and leaked documents. Reactions ranged from shock and outrage to disbelief and curiosity, with some expressing sympathy for Meghan and others condemning her actions outright. The rapid proliferation of opinions reflected not only the story's emotional weight, but also the intense public fascination with the private lives of the royal family. Major news outlets quickly mobilized investigative teams, seeking to uncover the full scope of the alleged sale and its implications. Journalists contacted former staff, palace insiders, jewelry experts, and legal authorities to piece together a comprehensive narrative. Each new report added layers of detail, often contradicting previous accounts or revealing new facets of the scandal. By the end of the first week, multiple exposés had been published, detailing alleged transactions, communications with high-end buyers, and potential breaches of trust regarding Diana's estate. The sheer volume and intensity of reporting created a constant media presence around Harry and Meghan, leaving little space for private reflection or family deliberation. Television coverage amplified the story further. Talk shows, news programs, and morning segments dedicated entire hours to analysis, often featuring panels of experts, royal commentators, and former staff. Visual storytelling played a significant role, with reenactments, timelines, and graphics illustrating how the alleged sale had unfolded. Clips of Meghan at public events, interviews, and casual appearances were re-examined under a new lens, suggesting calculated behavior and intentional manipulation. Analysts debated her motives, questioning whether financial gain, personal branding, or strategic positioning influenced her actions. The narrative framed Meghan as a polarizing figure, whose choices challenged traditional expectations of royal conduct. Public outrage was palpable. Forums and comment sections across news websites filled with heated discussions, with many expressing disappointment that the sanctity of Diana's legacy had been allegedly violated. Comparisons were drawn between Meghan's alleged behavior and previous royal controversies, with critics asserting that the monarchy had always been protective of its history, while supporters argued that Meghan had been unfairly vilified by the media and the public. Polls conducted during this period indicated a significant decline in favorability ratings for both Meghan and Harry, particularly among audiences with a strong attachment to Diana's memory. Social media influencers and content creators capitalized on the story, producing videos, blog posts, and live streams analyzing every development. Platforms like YouTube featured reaction channels dissecting Meghan's public appearances, her gestures, and interactions with staff. Commentators speculated on her motives, ranging from financial desperation to calculated public manipulation, and discussions often sparked viral debates. The story became a cultural touchpoint, dominating conversations not only about the royal family, but also about celebrity ethics, public perception, and the responsibilities of those with inherited influence. The international press was not limited to the United Kingdom or the United States. European tabloids, Asian news networks, and Middle Eastern outlets joined the coverage, each framing the narrative through their cultural and political lens. In some countries, Meghan was depicted as a cunning figure undermining the monarchy, while in others, she was portrayed as a victim of relentless scrutiny and double standards. The disparity in coverage highlighted the complex intersection of media narratives, cultural interpretation, and global public interest in the lives of the British royal family. Legal experts weighed in publicly, offering opinions on potential repercussions of the alleged sale. Questions arose about the legality of selling items from a royal estate, the authority of trustees managing Diana's assets, and possible breaches of contractual or ethical obligations. Analysts debated whether Meghan could face legal consequences, civil liability, or even criminal investigations depending on the specifics of the transactions. These expert opinions further fueled public debate, adding an additional layer of credibility to discussions while simultaneously increasing scrutiny on both Harry and Meghan. The paparazzi played a critical role in shaping the media storm. Previously loyal photographers were suddenly eager to capture images of Meghan in public, hoping to document her response to the scandal or any signs of tension with Harry. Photos of Meghan leaving appointments, visiting stores, or meeting with advisors were widely circulated, often accompanied by suggestive captions implying guilt, defensiveness, or secrecy. This constant visual surveillance intensified the public perception of wrongdoing, even when concrete evidence remained scarce or circumstantial. Every movement, expression, or gesture was analyzed and interpreted, creating a relentless pressure on Meghan to respond or clarify her position. Editorials and opinion columns debated the broader implications for the monarchy itself. Critics argued that the scandal could damage public trust in the institution, suggesting that family members could act with impunity when removed from direct oversight. Others countered that the monarchy's ability to absorb controversy had been historically resilient, pointing to previous instances of scandal involving financial mismanagement, marital strife, or public misconduct. The media's framing of Meghan's alleged actions sparked debates not only about personal ethics, but also about the monarchy's relevance, accountability, and capacity for oversight in an era of unprecedented transparency and global scrutiny. Meanwhile, commentators speculated on Harry's response to the public outcry. Observers noted that his previous efforts to maintain privacy and control over media narratives had been disrupted, forcing him into a reactive position. Public appearances, statements, and social media posts were interpreted as attempts to defend Meghan, mitigate fallout, or reassert control over the narrative. Analysts suggested that Harry faced a delicate balancing act, supporting his spouse while maintaining a degree of distance from actions that could be perceived as ethically or legally questionable. Every gesture he made was examined for consistency, sincerity, and alignment with the family's historical values. The role of public relations experts became increasingly prominent. Advisors specialized in crisis management, media strategy, and reputation repair were enlisted to craft statements, stage appearances, and manage the timing of disclosures. Their work included drafting official responses, coaching Harry and Meghan on messaging, and coordinating with legal counsel to avoid admissions of wrongdoing while attempting to preserve public empathy. This behind-the-scenes activity underscored the professional and calculated nature of the royal response to the scandal, illustrating that the family's handling of the crisis involved multiple layers of strategy and expertise. Amid this global attention, fan communities and royal enthusiasts engaged in vigorous debate. Some created petitions calling for accountability, while others organized support campaigns defending Meghan's character and intentions. These movements reflected the deeply polarized nature of public perception, illustrating that opinions about Meghan, Harry, and their actions were not monolithic, but varied widely based on perspective, cultural context, and prior loyalty. The intensity of these discussions fueled the ongoing media narrative, reinforcing the scandal's persistence in public consciousness. Media outlets also delved into Meghan's previous public statements, interviews, and charity work, scrutinizing her past for patterns that could suggest premeditation or opportunism. Segments highlighted inconsistencies between her advocacy for privacy and her alleged involvement in orchestrating press interactions or commercial transactions involving Diana's legacy. This retrospective examination amplified claims of hypocrisy, further intensifying criticism and contributing to a perception of strategic manipulation. Public discourse focused not only on the immediate events, but also on broader questions about authenticity, ethical responsibility, and the consequences of leveraging historical significance for personal gain. Cultural commentators examined the emotional resonance of the scandal. Diana's legacy held profound significance for millions of people worldwide, symbolizing compassion, integrity, and principled leadership. Allegations that items from her estate were being monetized without respect for her memory struck a particularly sensitive chord, creating moral outrage and emotional investment among audiences. The story became a lens through which broader societal questions were explored. How should personal ambition intersect with historical legacy? What are the ethical boundaries for public figures managing inherited influence? How do emotional connections to iconic individuals shape public reactions to scandal? In addition to traditional media coverage, podcasts and digital platforms amplified analysis and speculation. Long-form discussions dissected the chronology of events, interviewed insiders, and debated potential legal and financial consequences. These conversations often included emotional commentary, hypothetical scenarios, and direct engagement with audience questions, creating interactive layers of discourse that fueled further attention and public fascination. The reach of these platforms ensured that even audiences outside conventional media channels were actively participating in the ongoing discussion, broadening the scandal's scope and intensity. Advertising and sponsorships were not immune to the scandal's impact. Brands associated with Meghan or charitable organizations connected to Harry faced scrutiny, with some publicly distancing themselves to avoid perceived complicity. Financial analysts noted that the negative publicity could affect engagement, donations, and partnerships, underscoring the tangible economic consequences of high-profile controversies. The ripple effects extended beyond personal reputation, influencing institutions, commercial entities, and philanthropic endeavors connected to the royal family. The media storm created additional personal strain for both Harry and Meghan. The constant public scrutiny and relentless reporting intensified stress, anxiety, and feelings of isolation. Insiders reported that even routine activities, such as attending appointments, traveling, or engaging in charitable work, became highly monitored, amplifying the pressure and limiting opportunities for normalcy. The couple's mental health and emotional resilience were tested as they navigated the complex interplay of personal loyalty, public judgment, and historical legacy. International reactions further complicated the narrative. In countries with historical ties to the British monarchy, discussions ranged from outrage to fascination, often reflecting national perspectives on. As the media storm reached its peak, the tension within the Montecito estate became palpable. Harry had always been protective of Meghan, attempting to shield her from the relentless scrutiny of the press and public opinion. However, the allegations surrounding Diana's jewelry collection pushed him to a limit he had not anticipated. The scandal was no longer a private matter. It had escalated into a global narrative questioning not only Meghan's character, but also Harry's judgment, loyalty, and ability to manage crises. The weight of the world's attention, coupled with the personal betrayal he felt, began to manifest in visible strain. He was forced to confront the uncomfortable reality that his marriage, his personal integrity, and his reputation were being challenged simultaneously in the harshest spotlight imaginable. According to close sources, Harry had tried everything within his power to manage the narrative. Meetings with PR experts, strategic public appearances, and carefully worded statements were all orchestrated with precision. Yet, none of these measures seemed sufficient. Every press release, every public defense, was met with skepticism and critical analysis. The media seemed determined to scrutinize every detail, dissect every statement, and reinterpret every gesture. Harry's frustration grew as he realized that the tools he had relied upon for managing public perception were failing him. The carefully constructed image of a protective, thoughtful, and responsible royal appeared increasingly fragile under the weight of mounting allegations. In private moments, Harry wrestled with a profound sense of betrayal. He had trusted Meghan implicitly, believing in the partnership they had cultivated since their courtship. The revelations about the jewelry allegedly being sold without his knowledge or consent struck at the core of that trust. It was not only a question of legality or ethics, but of personal loyalty. He questioned every interaction, every conversation, and every decision they had made together, trying to reconcile the person he thought he knew with the actions being exposed. This internal conflict created an emotional turbulence that few could fully understand or empathize with, intensifying his sense of isolation. Family dynamics added another layer of complexity. Harry's relationship with the wider royal family had already been strained by previous conflicts, public scrutiny, and personal grievances. The scandal compounded these issues, placing him in a position where defending Meghan risked further alienating him from his relatives, while failing to act could imply tacit approval of alleged wrongdoing. Sources indicate that Harry spent long hours in consultation with advisors, weighing options, and attempting to find a course of action that balanced personal loyalty, public perception, and familial responsibility. The sheer complexity of these considerations left him feeling trapped, caught between competing pressures with no clear path forward. The Montecito home, once a sanctuary from the relentless gaze of the public, became a pressure cooker of anxiety, frustration, and tension. Staff members noticed Harry pacing for hours, speaking in clipped tones, and reacting sharply to even minor disruptions. Private security measures were intensified, reflecting both genuine concern for safety and the increasing sense of vulnerability felt by Harry. Despite these precautions, he could not escape the pervasive media attention or the judgmental gaze of the public, which seemed to follow him into every corner of his life. The tension within the estate mirrored the turmoil in his mind, creating an atmosphere thick with unease and anticipation. On multiple occasions, Harry attempted to confront Meghan directly, seeking answers and clarity regarding the allegations. These conversations, described by insiders as intense and emotionally charged, revealed a couple struggling to communicate amidst stress, mistrust, and fear of public exposure. Accusations, defensive statements, and pleas for honesty were reportedly exchanged, but the conversations often ended unresolved, leaving both parties feeling misunderstood and unsupported. For Harry, each interaction reinforced the sense that the foundation of trust in their relationship was crumbling, further amplifying his frustration and sense of helplessness. Adding to the strain was the relentless intrusion of journalists, paparazzi, and public speculation. Helicopters circled overhead, photographers stationed outside the estate, and anonymous tips flooded newsrooms with purported inside information. Each new report, whether accurate or speculative, added to Harry's sense of urgency and desperation. He recognized that inaction could result in further damage to both his reputation and the monarchy's public image. Yet any response carried the risk of escalating conflict or confirming negative narratives. The relentless media pressure left him feeling exposed, cornered, and increasingly reactive. Financial implications also weighed heavily on Harry. The alleged sale of Diana's jewelry was not only a personal betrayal, but a potential legal and fiscal crisis. Advisors warned of lawsuits, civil claims, and contractual violations that could result in significant monetary damages and public embarrassment. Harry, aware of the stakes, felt a heightened sense of responsibility to act decisively. The possibility of legal repercussions added another layer of urgency to his decision-making, forcing him to balance emotional impulses with strategic considerations. Every choice became fraught with consequences, magnifying the psychological strain he experienced. Friends and confidants noticed a shift in Harry's demeanor. Once calm, measured, and strategic, he began exhibiting signs of heightened stress and volatility. Emotional outbursts, moments of withdrawal, and intense focus on monitoring media coverage became commonplace. He spent hours reviewing articles, social media posts, and video clips, attempting to anticipate public reaction and counteract misinformation. Sources close to the couple describe a man grappling with conflicting impulses. The desire to protect his spouse, the need to maintain public credibility, and the pressure to uphold familial obligations. The resulting tension created a combustible emotional environment, in which small triggers could spark significant reactions. The breaking point reportedly came during a late-night review of leaked communications and alleged sales documents. Harry, confronted with what he perceived as irrefutable evidence of deception and betrayal, experienced a surge of anger, frustration, and despair. Witnesses describe him pacing the estate, speaking in sharp tones, and demanding immediate action. The cumulative weight of the media storm, public scrutiny, familial pressure, and personal betrayal reached a level that could no longer be contained within private deliberation or controlled communication strategies. At that moment, the decision to act decisively crystallized in his mind, driven by a combination of personal loyalty, moral outrage, and the need to regain control of his life and environment. Harry's decision to remove Meghan from the Montecito estate was not made lightly. It represented a profound personal and emotional judgment, reflecting a desire to restore order, assert boundaries, and protect his personal integrity. The act carried significant symbolic weight, signaling both to Meghan and to the public that there were consequences for alleged actions that violated trust, ethics, and shared responsibility. Sources indicate that Harry approached the situation with a mix of firmness, careful planning, and emotional intensity, determined to convey the seriousness of the breach while minimizing physical or legal confrontation. The logistical execution of the removal involved coordinated efforts with private security, legal advisors, and estate staff. Timing, discretion, and strategic planning were critical to avoid escalation or public spectacle. The operation was designed to be swift, controlled, and unavoidable, reflecting Harry's desire to assert authority while preserving his own safety and dignity. Details later leaked to the press suggested a meticulously organized effort, underscoring Harry's focus on precision and his unwillingness to allow the situation to spiral further out of control. The emotional impact on Meghan was immediate. Sources describe her initial reaction as one of shock, denial, and anger. Confronted with the reality of her removal, she reportedly attempted to negotiate, plead, and justify her actions, but Harry remained resolute. The confrontation highlighted the depth of mistrust that had developed between them and revealed the extent to which public exposure had amplified private conflict. Emotional intensity, rather than physical confrontation, defined the encounter, leaving both parties grappling with the ramifications of decisions made under extreme stress. In the aftermath, Harry experienced a mixture of relief, exhaustion, and lingering anxiety. Removing Meghan from the estate temporarily alleviated the immediate tension, creating a controlled environment in which he could begin to manage the media fallout, consult with advisors, and plan subsequent steps. Yet the consequences of the act, public speculation, familial judgment, and potential legal ramifications, remained pervasive. Harry's mental state reflected both the weight of responsibility and the emotional toll of making a decision with far-reaching personal, public, and historical consequences. Public reaction to Harry's action was immediate and intense. Social media exploded with commentary, ranging from praise for his decisiveness to criticism for the apparent severity of the response. News outlets reported extensively on the removal, framing it as a dramatic escalation in the ongoing saga of Harry and Meghan's controversial life in California. Analysts debated the ethical, psychological, and strategic dimensions of the action, considering the implications for public perception, familial relations, and the monarchy's broader reputation. The story became a focal point for discussions about power, trust, loyalty, and accountability in the context of high-profile relationships under global scrutiny. The episode underscored the complexity of life as a public figure in the digital age. Personal decisions, even when motivated by loyalty, ethics, or self-preservation, are magnified and dissected by audiences worldwide. Every action carries symbolic weight, reflecting on character, judgment, and broader cultural expectations. For Harry, the experience highlighted the delicate balance between personal integrity, protective instincts, and the pervasive gaze of the global public, demonstrating how quickly private conflicts can escalate into historic, high-stakes drama. Psychologists and commentators offered interpretations of Harry's behavior, suggesting that the removal reflected both a boundary-setting mechanism and an emotional response to perceived betrayal. They highlighted the interplay between stress, loyalty, and crisis management, noting that such decisions are often influenced by a combination of rational calculation and intense emotion. Observers drew parallels to other high-profile conflicts, emphasizing the universal challenges of trust, communication, and accountability when personal relationships intersect with public life. As the dust settled within the Montecito estate, Harry faced the dual challenge of managing his personal life and controlling the narrative. Subsequent days involved strategic communications, consultation with advisors, and careful monitoring of media coverage.